Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit more about, I'm going to talk a lot, about gerunds and infinitives. Why am I going to talk so much? Because gerunds and infinitives are a lot. They're a lot, okay? And even though the concept is pretty basic to understand when to use them, it's not easy to know when to use them. So hopefully you've watched my other video on subjects and objects with gerunds and infinitives within a sentence. This video, I'm going to expand on all that, okay? So let's start with reviewing what a gerund and an infinitive is, okay? So a gerund is just any verb plus ing, okay? And it represents an activity. So it can be swim plus ing, swimming. Run plus ing, running. Swimming, running, writing, talking, reading. These are all gerunds and they represent an activity. Therefore, they're not a verb. They're not a verb. They're a noun. They're an activity. Okay? So there's a difference between saying running is my favorite sport and I am running right now. You see the difference? So here's what I'm talking about. Running, just verb plus ing, nothing else around it. This is a gerund. It's the subject of the sentence. It represents an activity. This is the verb, is, okay? Over here, I am running is two parts. The be verb plus run plus verb plus ing. So here's the verb and the subject is I. They're completely different even though they look the same, so be careful with that. Okay, next part I want to say is that gerunds, they can be the subject of a sentence, but they can also function as an object in a sentence. So like this. So in this sentence down here that I wrote, you can see it says, I enjoy running. So the gerund now is way over here at the end of the sentence. It comes in the object position of the sentence. Remember, it's a noun, right? Just like this is. And it's coming after a verb. After verbs, we can have nouns sometimes. And in this case, we do. I enjoy running. So this is the object of a sentence. This is the object of the verb, actually. Okay, here we have the subject. This is the subject of this sentence, okay? Now, objects can also come after prepositions in English. So I look forward to running. I want to talk all day about running, okay? And so those are times when we would use a gerund as the object of a preposition and as the object of a verb, okay? Now let's talk about infinitives. So an infinitive looks like a verb as well. It starts with the word to, and then it ends with the base form of any verb, okay? So let's say, again, to run, just to be simple, to run. We have the to plus the base form of the verb. That's the infinitive form of a verb. Where can we put that? Well, we can put that as the subject or the object within a sentence. So let's see. Okay, in these sentences here, you see infinitives. The first one is at the beginning of the sentence as a subject. To run is fun. This is the subject, and here's the verb. To run is fun. Here, we're using it as the object after the verb wait, okay? I can't wait to run. Here, it's as the object, okay? Now, let me say something about infinitives. You can also use them after some nouns, like time, which we'll talk about later. You can also use them after certain adjectives, okay? Like, I'm excited to learn about gerunds, okay? But something you should know is that when we use an infinitive in the subject position, like here, of a sentence, it sounds a little strange. It's not wrong. It is totally grammatically correct, but people don't use this form when they're talking or even when they're writing that much. Instead, people will use the gerund form of a verb, okay, as a subject of a sentence. So instead of using the infinitive form as the subject, we would say running is fun. Or you can change around that sentence and say it like this with keeping the infinitive. It, you start with the word it, and then you say what the verb, it is fun, and then to run. And then you put the infinitive. Here's the infinitive at the end. What does this it mean? What is that? The it actually is this activity. It is this infinitive. And this is a much more common way to express this idea. If you want to use the infinitive in the subject position, consider changing it to a gerund or adding the word it and moving the infinitive to the end. Okay, so that's all I want to say about gerunds and infinitives on a basic level. I think that basic information is something you can grasp like that, or maybe with a little bit of studying. What's hard about gerunds and infinitives is even though you might understand this and you can take a test and get a great grade on this understanding, the hard part is actually using a gerund and an infinitive at the right time, and I'm going to talk about why right now. Okay, so now is the hard part. This is where we start talking about, hold on, wait. Okay, now is the hard part. This is where we start talking about all those little details about when to use a gerund and when to use an infinitive in the object position within a sentence. So here goes. I'm going to share with you what I use with my class, okay? And it's this chart that shows, okay, here in the heading, at the top of each of the chart, you see verb plus infinitive. So it's telling you what verbs take an infinitive after them. So for example, he agreed, there's the verb, to meet, there's the infinitive, me. He agreed to meet me, okay? So what verbs will take an infinitive like this? Because you can't just throw an infinitive after any verb in English. I can't say, I enjoy to run. It's wrong. Enjoy is a verb that cannot have the word to run or any infinitive after it because it's just not grammatical. So therefore, now you have to go, okay, I know I can use infinitive as the object after a verb, but which verbs? Which verbs take infinitives after them? Here's that list. So, agree. For example, I agree to meet you. It appears to be late. Let's arrange to meet tomorrow. I'm going to ask to help someone, right? Let's attempt to call her, okay? I care to help you out. Taking bag out. Okay. Choose. I choose to wait. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you can get an idea here that here's a list of verbs that might be good to know for you in starting to know when to use an infinitive after a verb and when to not. And in these verbs, you can use infinitives after them, okay? And there's more. There's more. This is not all of them. This is the hard part about gerunds and infinitives. So let's look at the next chart. The next chart is a list of verbs that take a noun or a pronoun, which is a word like it, me, you, he, she, then the infinitive, okay? So for example, like this sentence, I don't want you to go now. I don't want's the verb, you, that's the noun or the pronoun, to go, that's the infinitive, okay? So if you're not sure about when, if you can use an infinitive after want, and then you're talking about wanting someone else to do something or know something, then you need to know these are the verbs that you use plus the noun or a pronoun and then an infinitive. So let me give you some more examples. I advise all my students to read. That's a good way to learn gerunds and infinitives. The police officer allowed the driver to go away without a ticket. Ask. I need to ask you to help me. Okay. Assign. The teacher assigned us to write an essay. Okay. Authorize. All of the whole list. Authorize, call, cause, challenge. All of these verbs will take a noun or a pronoun, then the infinitive form. What you can't do is you can't say, you can't use one of these verbs, for example, and say, I encourage you studying hard. You cannot say, I encourage you studying hard. It doesn't work because encourage is a verb that requires first a noun or a pronoun. I encourage you, and then the infinitive. I encourage you to study hard. I encourage you to read. I encourage everyone to read. That's how you're going to learn this stuff the best way, okay? It's also not okay to say, I encourage to read. So most of these verbs, you need to have that noun. You can't just say, I challenge to study hard. You have to say, I challenge you to study hard. I convinced him to help me. You can't say, I convinced to help me. It has to have a noun or pronoun before that infinitive. So look at this list and kind of familiarize yourself with it so that you can notice an error when you are talking or writing, okay? Which you will make. You will make errors, and that's totally normal, okay? But then you know where to go to find more information. So the next list, there's a lot, is when to use a noun plus an infinitive. So infinitives can be used after certain nouns. For example, it is not time to see the movie yet. Time is the noun. To see is the infinitive, okay? So it's not time to go. It's your chance to help. I'm going to attempt to call you. I have a decision to make. There is a strong desire to take a break right now. My goal, or I have a goal to graduate before I turn, 20 or 30 or whatever your age, okay? These nouns take infinitives after them, okay? And there's more, but this is just a list to start with. Okay, the next list is adjectives plus infinitives. So you can use an infinitive after an adjective, okay? I'm excited, that's the adjective, to see you, that's the infinitive. I'm amazed to see your work. I'm afraid to go. I'm anxious to call. I'm always careful to check my errors. I'm eager to go back to school. I'm glad to meet you. I'm lucky to know this information. So these are just adjectives that we often use with an infinitive after them. All right, we're moving along. The next one is a list for verbs that take a gerund. So I want to stop for a second here and point out that so far we have looked at 4 columns of times where we will use an infinitive after something. So to review, we use an infinitive after certain verbs, not all verbs. We use an infinitive after certain verbs plus a noun and a pronoun, like in the second column. We use infinitives after certain nouns, okay? We can also use infinitives after adjectives, okay? So in the next part of this list, I'm focusing on gerunds. So when do we use a gerund in the object position? We can use it after verbs, but you can't use gerunds after all verbs. I can't say, I want studying. I cannot say that. I want to study. You need an infinitive. But I can say, I admit studying is hard. I advise studying hard. I appreciate working hard. I avoid staying up too late, right? So this is a list of verbs that take gerunds. So just like in the example, children enjoy learning. Enjoy is a verb that takes a gerund. Okay, so you can study this list here and look at it as well. Okay, the next list is when we use a verb plus a gerund or an infinitive. Isn't that great? Okay, it's just not easy, right? It's harder and harder. But certain verbs can take a gerund and they can take an infinitive. What? Okay, it would be nice if they were all like that, but they're not. Okay, so we can look at the examples here. We continued making plans, or we continued to make plans. Both of those have completely the same meaning. They're completely fine, okay? I can afford to travel, or I can afford traveling. Those are both okay. I attempt to help you. I attempt helping you. Let's begin to meet. Let's begin meeting. See, these have the same meaning even though it's a gerund or an infinitive after these verbs, and that's okay, but how do you know that? How do you know when to use one or the other when all the other times we know that you have to be really careful? It's hard to know that. It's really hard to know that, but I always recommend reading and talking to people. So you can take a look at this list, but I'm going to highlight the word forget, and I'm also going to there's already a star next to it. Okay, the word forget and the word stop and remember. Okay, in these cases, you can use both a gerund or an infinitive after them, but the meaning changes. Okay, so let's start with the example with stop. Okay, so let's take a look at this example. They stopped to eat. So there's the verb stop. And after it, here we have an infinitive. They stopped eating. Here we have a gerund. They're both correct, but the meaning changes completely depending on whether you use an infinitive or a gerund. So what does it mean to use an infinitive after the word stop? It means that you stopped something else, some other activity, in order to eat. Okay, so it's like they were driving. They stopped driving to eat. And then later they continued to drive, right? Or maybe they were talking. They stopped talking. You can add that there if you want. They stopped talking to eat, in order to eat. That was the reason, okay? Here, if we use a gerund after stop, it means that you quit some activity. You completely quit this thing. Now, is that what you want to say? They stopped eating? If someone stops eating, they'll starve. They're not going to have food. They quit eating? That's not good, right? Unless maybe you're saying that they quit eating for that meal only, okay? So it depends on what you want to say. They stopped smoking. That means they quit. They stopped yelling at each other. That means they quit yelling. Okay? So that's the difference with the word stop when you use a gerund or an infinitive. Let's talk about remember. Okay, here we have some more examples. We have remembered to call and remembered calling. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, they're both correct, okay? But if you say he remembered to call, that just means that he remembered something that he needed to do, some obligation that he had, and he remembered that obligation. He remembered to call, okay? That's a good thing. He remembered calling. This just means that he remembers the activity of calling, okay? He remembers what he said, he remembers who he was talking to, he remembers all the details, okay? He remembers the activity. Now, the same thing is with the word forget, okay? You can say he forgot to call. That means he had an obligation that he forgot about. You can also say he forgot calling. He forgot the activity of calling. It means he called someone and they had a conversation, but he forgot that conversation. He forgot that activity, okay? So you can remember to do your work. You have an obligation to do work. You remember to do your work. That's a good thing. If you did your work and it's finished, then you probably remember doing your work, the activity, the process. But if you forget to do your work, that's not good because you had an obligation to do something and you forgot. But if you just forgot doing it, that's not so bad because you did the activity, you just forgot about it. You forgot what that was like to do. I'm sure we all have things that we did in our past that we don't remember doing. I forgot sitting in class when I was young. I forgot the feeling of sitting in class when I was young. I forgot talking to my mom on the phone when I was 15 years old. I'm sure I did it a lot, but I don't remember that activity, okay? So when we use it as a gerund, we're talking about an activity. When we're using it as an infinitive with forget and remember, we're talking about it as an obligation, okay? Okay, and that is what I want to say about forget and remember. But let's not forget, we have plenty of verbs that can take a gerund or an infinitive after them, and they are here, okay? There's plenty more, this is just a short list, but something you can start with. Now, the easiest thing, in my opinion, is to remember that gerunds also come as objects of prepositions. That means that they come after a preposition. So words like to, of, on, about, over, in, from, at. Look at the example here. I look forward to is the preposition, seeing you. That's the gerund, okay? So here's the list I give my students so they can get an idea and categorize and classify all these different times when they can and cannot use a gerund or an infinitive in the object position. But down here, I also tell them it's important to sort of understand or remember or at least see that there are combinations that go together a lot that often will result in a gerund afterwards because they end in a preposition like this one, look forward to. It's the verb look forward plus the preposition to. Look forward to. Be afraid of. I'm afraid of taking tests. Be excited about. I'm excited about taking a break. Insist on. I insist on helping you. Be interested in. I'm interested in learning more about this idea. Or down here, we have adjectives and prepositions that often go together that result in a gerund following them. So, accustomed to. I'm accustomed to helping my students with their grammar. Amazed at. I'm amazed at seeing your growth. Anxious about. I'm anxious about taking my test next week. Okay, so here's a list, another list that is helpful to kind of be aware of. But with all this stuff, it's just too much to memorize. I don't recommend memorizing anything. I just recommend being aware of these categories and these rules. Because then when you're trying to use the language, you will attempt to follow these rules, and you will also break them and make mistakes, which is totally normal and expected. But because you know these rules, you might have a little idea that you made a mistake, and that's good. It's called monitoring. You're monitoring your speech. And when you feel that something's wrong, you can go back and reference this list and check to see if you were right or wrong. Now, you won't be able to do that all the time, but maybe you will sometimes. And what I do recommend is talking to people in English and reading in English. That's what I always recommend. Then you will certainly see these forms and they will come to you automatically, but it will take time. It will take years. But at least by looking at this, you have an idea of what is happening so you can start to use these forms yourself. Okay, so that is the end of this video, and I hope that it was helpful. Bye.